This lecture is on the native mountain goat we have in the Tennessee, commonly referred to as the mountain goat, Eremos americanus. Eremos, the genus, comes from the Greek oros. The stem is or, meaning mountain, and menos, meaning lamb. So their genus is loosely translated as mountain lamb, and Americanus because it's associated with North America. Here's a picture of one. I believe this comes from the Cascades as well, but kind of gives you an idea of what this critter looks like. Mountain goats, the males are referred to as billies and the females are referred to as nannies. For mountain goats, both males and females, billies and nannies, have beards, short tails, and black horns. And so in other bighorn sheep, things like that, the horns can differentiate between males and females. Here for mountain goats, both have black horns. And these horns contain annual rings the same way that trees contain annual rings. And so the length, the size of the horns is an indication of age, which is interesting because it's different than antlers, which are shed every year, and antlers are actually an indication of current physiological health more so than age. Yes, 1 year old individuals will have smaller antlers, but a 3 and a 7-year-old, for example, black-tailed deer, could have relatively the same size antlers, or the 3-year-old could have much larger antlers, because that's an indication of their current physiological state rather than age. Where here, horns aren't shed every year. They stay there and they grow a little bit every year, and they lay down the annual ring. So we can age mountain goats by the rings on their horns, and the amount of growth for any given year is an indication of overall health of that organism, which could track environmental abundance. Is it a good year or not? Things like that. So there's a fair amount of ecological data contained within their annual rings of their horns as well. They have a dense, woolly double coat that they shed in the spring, and so they put on a thick wool for the wintertime, shed it in the spring. This image down below looks like this animal is shedding some of its winter wool here as well. They're quite long-lived, 12 to 15-year lifespans, pretty long for, you have to think about this, critters living in the alpine and subalpine. I mean, they are really quite far up there. And they're in a really extreme environment, and so living to be 15 years old is quite old in my opinion. And their age is limited by tooth wear, and so eventually their teeth wear out and they're not able to browse as efficiently, and that leads to malnutrition and then eventual death, typically during the winter. They breed in the fall, and they have a number of kind of mating rituals, kind of similar to what you think of as like what mountain rams do. Males, bashing their heads against each other, things like that. And it's also interesting that if you're the most dominant male, if you're king of the hill, you might not make it through the winter because you've focused all of your attention during breeding time, which is in the fall, to defending your territory, keeping other billies away from the nannies, sparring, perhaps getting injured, while other males could be out browsing, fattening up for the winter to make sure they make it through. Where if you're dedicated to being king of the hill, perhaps you're going in the winter both bruised, beaten, perhaps injured, and potentially near starvation. So there's kind of a trade-off between trying to keep everybody away from the nannies and potentially your survivorship through the winter. Billies and nannies tend to stay in separate groups. You'll often see big groups of nannies with young. The younger billies might pack together, and then the older billies will be more solitary. Will be kind of off by themselves. And these are grazers. They consume greens, any green that you might imagine. Also, mosses, lichens, and twigs. Particularly in the winter, things like mosses and lichens are a pretty important part of their diet. This is a map of the current distribution of mountain goats. So it's not historical data, but this is where they're currently found. It's pretty interesting that there's none found on Vancouver Island. And you can kind of see they more or less follow this Cascade Ridge. There's a couple pockets here and there. And then in Washington, we find them through the Cascades. We find them up the Sunshine Coast on the coast of British Columbia, all the way up through southeast Alaska. And this little pocket over here on the peninsula we'll talk about a little bit later. But again, this is the current distribution of mountain goats, not their historic distribution. Some of you may have heard, and in fact, one of the Western faculty, Dave Wallen, has been heavily involved in this project. But there's a large project to remove mountain goats from the Olympic National Park and relocate them to the Cascades. Here's an image of the first stage of that, which is they find some mountain goats up on the hill. They hit them with a tranq dart. They put a blindfold over them, kind of a rubber hose over the horns. They tie their feet together, put them in these little slings, helicopter them out, drop them on a Fish and Game truck. Then they're put in a refrigerated container, driven overnight to the Cascades, and then released there. All of these animals are radio collar tagged, every single one that's moved from the Olympics to the Cascades. And so we actually have good data on their survivorship, and we can go back and track those animals to see if they're breeding. The reason this is happening is mountain goats were not endemic to the Olympic National Park or to that Olympic range. That they were moved in the 1920s for recreational hunting. And then as the population began to grow, in 1938, just a few years later, that area became the Olympic National Park, which prohibits hunting. So these animals were moved so people could go out and hunt them for sport. A few years later, that's totally changed, and they're no longer allowed to hunt mountain goats in the Olympic National Park. And goats were relatively happy there. They kept breeding and increasing in population, which is an issue because it was they were overgrazing fragile plant populations, and that also increases erosion. So plants help hold the soil together, and if plants are overgrazed, those plants are no longer able to keep the soil together, and that increases erosion. There's a couple of human-goat conflicts as well, and at the same time, the Cascade population is below their population target. And so the Cascades needed mountain goats. The Olympics had too many, and so they decided the best thing to do was to start moving goats from the Olympics to the Cascades. And this has been done every year for the past couple of years. And it's been pretty effective. They've moved, I think they've interacted with 300 and some goats and successfully moved 250-ish. And I think the population on the Olympics was maybe in the 600 range. And so one issue, though, is as hard as they try, there are certain goats that are going to be inaccessible to capture. Picture a solo goat on a cliff face. There's no way you can get in there and tranq dart that goat, and there's no way if you were able to do that, you could easily or successfully or safely bridle it and carry it out with a helicopter. So there's going to be a certain number of goats left in the Olympics that are not easily accessible by this method. And the solution, although I'm sure it will be rather controversial, the solution that's proposed is lethal removal of those, which will look like the ever popular shooting mountain goats from a helicopter. That's likely what's going to happen. There'll be a fair amount of controversy associated with it, and likely a couple lawsuits, and that's something that'll unfold over the next couple of years, and so it's worth keeping an eye on. But there's a lot of permitting that's required, and a large legal framework that's required even to do the non-lethal removal, because they're bringing helicopters into a national park, which amongst moving the animals themselves, but the actually flying helicopters in the national park is something that's typically not allowed, and takes a tremendous amount of agreement at the federal level for that to happen. Traditionally, mountain goats were very important for wool. Hopefully we'll touch a bit on the Coast Salish woolly dog as well, another source of wool for Coast Salish people. But the mountain goat fur was wool was a big textile for woven products. Most of this wool was picked up from mountain goat sheds. So you'd go up into the mountains in the spring, and as mountain goats are shedding their wool, it sticks to branches and things like that. And these animals they follow pretty common paths, and so you more or less go to those kind of mountain goat highways, and you can find a fair amount of fur, and then bring that down and process that. Additionally, if any mountain goats were killed for food, you could roll the skin up, keeping the flesh sides together, and after several days the wool would naturally shed. And so that's another way that you could harvest wool from a mountain goat. Obviously not the most sustainable way of getting fur from the same goat year after year, but nonetheless that was one way that was done, in addition with cutting or mixing it with wool from the woolly dog. And these blankets, these wool blankets, would have been very highly regarded. This probably wouldn't be the sort of thing that most people would have. It's very much something for somebody associated with a higher rank. Very, very valuable products, something made of woolly dog hair and mountain goat hair as well. Just a brief touch on mountain goats. Through your species story or through other activities, you can definitely delve more deep into the mountain goats. But just a couple of interesting tidbits about mountain goats. A really cool organism. Really cool to have them here in the Salish Sea. And interesting to see kind of what's happening with them from a biological and kind of social standpoint as well. So Heishka, thank you.